Welcome everyone. Today is Tuesday. It's about to be reset day for NA in about an hour, and then tomorrow it's gonna be for you. We're gonna go over the new week of Affixes for Mythic Plus, some things raid related and progression related, but more importantly, we are also going to go over the entirety of Mythic Plus this season. You know why? I bet you don't, because this week is the last week of Affixes. With this coming week, Tyrannical, Raging and Explosive, we will have gone through the entire season worth of Affixes. We will get to talk about the new ones, how have they been, as well as the dead Affixes, the one that we lost along the way from BFA. Not only that, but also the changes that have been done to the Affixes and whether or not they were good or bad. So let's just start with this week, this upcoming week, because of course it's Tyrannical, Raging and Explosive. Let me just point out, like immediately, because I don't want to get triggered. I know I will, but still, I'm trying to help. Rogues, my dear friends, this was a thing 10 years ago. Your Shiv can dispel enrage effects if you put Numbing Poison on. Yes, Shiv has a longer cooldown. It's, you know, more annoying to use than a Druid Soothe, for example, but you can still be useful to your party. Again, if you have absolutely no slows in your party during a Raging week, it's still probably better to keep on Crippling Poison to keep the entire pack of mobs perma-slowed, but if you do have any other slow, then please take Numbing Poison and help with the enrages. Now, remember, since, as I mentioned, this is the first week in Shadowlands that any of you gets to deal with Explosive, that Explosive now is going to appear slightly farther away from the enemies that summon them. You're not going to pull a pack of 6 and then there's going to be 3 explosives hidden in the models of the mobs. Explosive also now has a fixed health bar. It will not scale with key level anymore, which is also good. And then lastly, and more irrelevantly, they're going to make a sound when they are defeated. I'm going to redirect you to some help for Explosive because, for example, you can go to wago.io and you can take the Mythic Plus colored mob preset for Plater. Plater is a target frame add-on. There is a few popular ones. There is Plater, there is Tidy Plates and Threat Plates. But this one is very easy because it has tons of options that you don't even need to care about. Because you can just go on a site like this one and just import the preset that people better than you encoding this and preparing this can do. In this case, for example, Explosive Orb is going to be orange. The only frame that's going to be orange in the entire pack. It's going to be very easy to see. If you don't want to use Plater, if you're not using Plater, you can take something like the Affix Helpers. This is a straight up weak aura that can help you. If you don't want to use weak auras, then this is not 2007 anymore. Please modernize. This is a weak aura that, for example, is going to allow you to keybind a specific button to hide all of the nameplates except for Explosive Orbs. So there is a pool with 7 mobs. The explosives are spawning. You're fucking panicking. Just press your keybinding, your C, your G, your extra mouse button or whatever, and then all of the nameplates are going to disappear and just Explosive is going to be visible. Now, this is another week where technically speaking, you could be taking 0 damage from the mobs, right? Because you can basically dodge Raging by kiting and by dispelling, and you can dodge Explosive Orb damage by simply taking them down. So, strictly speaking, this is very, very good on fortified weeks. When you have fortified weeks that can basically prevent any damage or any help to the pack of mobs you're pulling, it's going to be a very good week. Now, we all know that it's not going to be completely possible to avoid the raging damage. It's not going to be completely possible to dispel enrage on all the mobs. So you will be taking damage. We know that. But it is not too bad of a week in terms of combinations. The fact that Explosive is now much easier to deal with, much less HP, much more visible and less annoying to actually target. And Raging is more or less compounding on the bad vice Blizzard has forced onto all tanks, which is kiting. We are in a situation where earlier than the previous couple of expansions, tank kiting has become a thing. Even at 10, 11 or 12 keys, you're like, wait, I'm looting 203, I'm looting 207 loot, I am 214 and I still have to kite because I'm getting clobbered. So Raging is not really going to change much in the way tanks are tanking, because they are kiting anyways, regardless of Raging. Now, all Raging is going to do is force even the lazy tanks that want to face tank everything to move a little bit, but that's it. This is another week where quick, agile and mobile tanks are going to have an easy time, or rather easier time than others. And unfortunately, we are talking about Vengeance Demon Hunter. Unfortunately, as the tank with already over 40% representation, they are going to continue being very good on this week because of how quickly they can just disengage from a raging pack of mobs. A tank, for example, like a Guardian Druid or a Blood DK are going to have a much harder time. A Protection Paladin will be able to scrape by with Divine Steed and a perma-slow Consecration. A Monk, of course, is going to have no problem. The real, toughness of the week for Trash Pools is just going to be for Guardian and Blood DK. And there are, higher issues when it comes to mobility, even though, to be fair, a Night Fae Guardian Druid with Soul Shape, with Ursul's Vortex in Rest of Affinity, even with Wild Charge, it is still quite better than Death Knight, but still not as good as the other specs. Now remember, a couple of days ago, when we made the video about this last week's affixes, I pointed out the importance of things like space and density when it comes to affixes like Sanguine, affixes like Quaking, even technically things like Explosive, things like Volcanic, and things like Storming and Spiteful are going to be affected by these values. How much space do you have to run around, and how much space do you have to kite the mobs, as well as how many mobs are going to be in a pack. This week, it's not that important when it comes to raging. Yes, of course, more mobs means you're not going to be able to dispel them all, because Dispel and Rage has a cooldown, so you won't be able to do that. But normally speaking, when there is multiple mobs, a bunch of them are going to be at low enough HP that you can just cleave an AoE down, so their enrage that is not even worth dispelling. The problems of density isn't really there when it comes to raging. The problem with spacing also isn't there, because you don't need sideways space with raging. You just need back space. You just need to kite back or forward, either one. Sanguine and Quaking gives you a problem in depth, in width, because if you're in a corridor, you can't go to the sides. You have to go either up or down. But if you want to kite, then a corridor is going to be just enough. It's not going to be too difficult, The Gauntlet of Sanguine Depths is a nightmare on Quaking and Sanguine, but in Raging isn't really that difficult to deal with. You just run back or forward. You're going to be fine. So density and space are not an issue for Raging. For Explosive, on the other hand, space isn't really a problem, of course, but density, of course, might be. Of course, remember, the more mobs, the more chances they have to spawn the Explosive. So it can still be a problem. It isn't as annoying, it isn't as disruptive as things like Sanguine and Quaking, even more so if they are together. Then this week is coming paired with Raging, which doesn't really put any strain on these two facets of your dungeon key, so it shouldn't be too big of a deal. So in the end, Explosive and Raging are not that big of a deal. They're going to be a pretty nice week for doing Mythic Plus. Again, it's going to be a harder week simply because it's Tyrannical. Tyrannical is going to be, I will repeat for the 100th time, much worse for pugs than it's going to be for organized groups. So it's not going to be likely as easy as this week when it comes to pugs, but it's still going to be on the easy side when it comes to combination of affixes. Now, before we go at the overall look of Mythic Plus this season, let's step for a few minutes into the raid category. Now, I want you to look at these numbers. By this point, I like numbers. I have been showering with numbers, data, graphs, and bars for a long time now, so let's continue with this trend. These are the numbers of Heroic Uldir. Why am I showing you these numbers? Because these are the numbers of Heroic Castle Nathria. Now you can see that the amount of kills going from Talok to Vectis are very high, very close to each other. From 30 to 27,000. There is a very tiny difference between the guilds that kill Talok all the way down to the guilds that kill Vectis, whereas when you go and look at Castle Nathria, you start at Shriekwing at 21,000, and by the time you are at Sunken Salvation or Zymox, it has almost halved, 13 to 12,000 kills. By Council of Blood time, it's already below half. The Nathrius has a 1 in 6 kill chance from the guilds who started killing Shriekwing. Only 1 in 6 will actually go down and kill the Nathrius, whereas when you look at Uldir, there is a 30 to 18,000 difference. So it's like a 60%. It's more like a 4 in 6 chance to actually finish off Gahun if you went in and killed Talok. Of course, the deeper we go into the gear, there's going to be more gear for players. Eventually, I know it's slow, but eventually there will be. And very likely, more likely than not, more hotfixes and more nerfs. So it's going to become easier to kill the boss. But the numbers, when it comes to just the participation, it is very good. But the question is another one. The participation is good because take in mind that these numbers from Uldir span over 10 months. We are barely into the first month of Castle Nathria. So looking at 20,000 Shriekwing kills when there were 30,000 Tallow kills in 10 months is very good. Of course, there's not going to be 20,000 Shriekwing kills every month because there's going to be way less players clearing Shriekwing for the first time 3 months into the expansion, of course. But still, the numbers are looking good. The question here is how many of these kills are from new players, or rather new raiders, who have been introduced to raiding due to the lack of loot. It is a valid question because in the last couple of expansions people didn't necessarily need to do heroic. Because, of course, Titan Forging, because Mythic Plus, because high amount of loot from the end of the dungeon cache in Mythic Plus, even more so in Legion. And then, of course, there was the Titan Forging. Even after that Titan Forging was partially removed, in Nyalota there was still corruption from gear. So it could be the plan of Blizzard all along. We are going to cut the loot from dungeons to force or to push, to invite more people into raiding. Now, of course, this would be a perfect plan if raiding actually dropped any fucking loot. Now, it doesn't that much, I have been finding, so I do enjoy the plan. This is something I mentioned over a month ago when the news about the loot changes were coming in, that this was a good change if you were planning to bring more people into raids. It was a good change if you were planning on keeping heroic raiding more valuable and more durable throughout the tier, to not keep heroic raiding as some sort of a joke, you know, something that people can just skip and whatever. I will keep empowering my character doing Mythic Plus only. Who cares about heroic? This would have been a good change. The question, of course, would have been, how much does it hurt Mythic Plus? How many players are gonna drop from Mythic Plus or do less Mythic Plus because there is much less loot? And I am actually here to answer this as well. I'm on a roll today, full of answers, because if you look at Mythic Plus from BFA in Season 1, literally every player, not just the high keys or the pros or whatever, every key from the moment Mythic Plus was basically available towards the end of August to the moment it ended the first season, which was the 26th of January, there are 4.9 million in BFA Season 1. This is in about 5 months. In the first month of Mythic Plus, there are 3.6 million. So it has reached about 70% of the target of BFA with 4 months left to go. So no, Mythic Plus representation has not gone down compared to BFA. It has actually gone massively up. And raid participation is on projection to be up. Another quick look, just to finish things for raids about the current progression. I wanted to point out that at the moment there are 27 guilds that have killed the Nathrius, whereas at the same point in time there were 204 guilds that killed Xavius. I know, it's cheating, I'm using Emerald Nightmare. And 49 guilds that killed Gahun. So about half the guilds that killed Gahun have killed the Nathrius. If you look at the tier after, I know it doesn't make sense to compare the first tier of an expansion to the second tier, but just as a little bit of an insight for more raids to compare it to, only 9 guilds actually killed Gul'dan at this point in time in Nighthold. Rather tough raid, similar you could say to Castle Nathria, and then there is Battle of the Zavalor with 36 Jaina kills. So it is still performing amongst one of the harder of the more recent expansions. Finally, the point about EU and NA representation. There are currently 303 guilds working on the last, more important bosses of this raid, from Council of Blood onwards. So from Council and then Sludgefist, Stone Legion, and then working on the Nathrius, that there are 303 guilds from Europe and 127 guilds from NA, with about 65 or 70 from China and Korea. Now, you might say, oh well, this is shit, NA sucks. It is actually a decent improvement from Uldir, from the first tier of BFA. Basically, we went from having 1 in 4 guilds being in NA, as far as the top guilds go, to 1 in 3. So there is slightly more guilds. I mean, significantly. That's like a 25% increase compared to the last expansion. Is it because Limit has gotten more world first kills now? NA is a little bit more represented at the top, even though it is mostly just Limit and Big Dumb Guild. If you look at basically the top 10, there is just Europe and then 2 US guilds. But still, better than before, certainly. Maybe it's that. I don't know, but it is certainly better for the health of the game, at least on the NA side of things. Now, let's go back for a few minutes to talk about Mythic Plus. We have to talk about Mythic Plus, because we have now, as I mentioned already, gone an entire season worth of affixes. We have lost, along the way, skittish and teaming. So let's start with that first, before going on to the new ones. Did anyone really like skittish or teaming? I'm pretty sure nobody did, although when it came to skittish, people at least didn't consider it that big of an issue. They considered it sort of like a free affix for the week, except for when they were playing melee and then somebody turned around and one-shot them, and then they hated it. But for the most part, it was a very weak affix. It just pushed for no reason, as if there was any more need, classes like rogues and hunters into your group, because of your misdirection and tricks of the trade, for more threat on your tank, whereas teaming was just straight up cancer. The random addition of mobs along the way, making the packs bigger, created just a much more annoying way of dealing with mobs. It came to the point where even on tyrannical weeks, just having teaming was annoying enough that it made you forget you weren't on fortified. Not to mention, the scaling at higher keys was completely wonky, because at lower keys, certain mobs added to certain packs weren't really an issue, but then you get to the point of keys high enough where an innocuous, innocent, little cast that you usually even ignore because it's not your priority, if you didn't interrupt it, it would one-shot you at high enough keys, and then teaming made this problem even worse. So it was just a bad affix overall. I don't think anyone will complain. They are gone. Now, for the current affixes, before we talk about the new ones, we have to talk about, first, the work of Blizzard in fixing or, changing the current affixes, because Bursting, Volcanic, Sanguine, Grievous, and Explosive all have gotten changes. We have mentioned Explosive already. You will see it this week, but I'm pretty sure nobody will have complaints in the way Explosive has been improved in this expansion, so it's a positive change. Grievous, another one. Damage is now a flat amount that scales with keystone level up to +15. I repeat, up to +15, rather than a percentage of players' maximum health. Also, you just have to heal to remove a stack. You don't have to get the guy high in HP to remove the stack anymore. You have already gone through Grievous already once, so it has definitely been improved. You probably have noticed it, certainly if you were a healer. Maybe you were a little bit too busy getting triggered by Spiteful, because that's what Grievous came in, like 4 weeks ago, but the affix in and of itself has definitely been improved. There's been another improvement to Sanguine, which is minor, but is still a decent quality of life for you, which is that the duration went from 60 seconds to 20, which means that now you can actually get it to disappear. You can pull a pack, and then because of space limitations, you might have wanted to pull the pack back, but because it's Sanguine, it's all cancer. Now, with a 20-second despawn timer, by the time you get to the second pull, your original Sanguine pulls are going to be mostly gone, so it's just a decent quality of life change. You have Volcanic. This might be the first 50-50 split, because the previous Volcanic used to do 40% of your HP. Now, it's only doing 20. However, if you get hit, you're going to get knocked pretty high up in the air. Basically, it interrupts you, it stops you. Some people might be happy with this, some people might not. Some people prefer the extra damage taken at the cost of not being interrupted. I'm pretty sure healers like the new version and DPSers don't. But in general, it is a positive change. The other similar change was done to Quaking, which I mentioned before, the last week, before we went over the week with Quaking. The fact that Quaking used to do half the damage it's doing now, 20% of your max HP. But your own Quaking would always hit yourself. Now, Quaking does 40% of your max HP, but only if you overlap it, basically only if you put yours on top of another player. Meaning, it's going to be doing 0 damage. Ideally, you always spread, you never overlap with someone else, meaning Quaking never does any damage. So that's another positive change. And lastly, of course, Bursting. This was an older change as well. The fact that now Bursting is a magic effect that can be dispelled. And similar to what they did already with Grievous, now Bursting has a flat amount of damage that scales with key level up to +15 instead of the player's maximum health. You have already noticed how much little damage Bursting does compared to previous expansions. I have seen literally quite a few players with still old BFA macros about Bursting and stopping DPS on certain stacks. I still see people shouting 3 stacks stop or 4 stacks stop. 4 stacks at like a +12 is not even going to be doing 40% of your max HP. Back in BFA, 4 stacks meant you had to use a CD to deal with it. So it's another positive change. So all of these current affixes have been I would say, quite significantly improved overall compared to the state in which they were before. What about the new ones? Because we have Spiteful, Inspiring, and Storming. So Inspiring, I guess, is the easiest one to get rid of because it is very simple. It's literally part of the old Nyalota emissaries with the add that stopped CCs inside its circle, inside its bubble. There is really not much else. The difference is that you couldn't CC it, but you could just have one guy spam a Moonfire on it and pull it back while you dealt with the pack. Instead, now you can straight up CC it and pull the rest of the pack. Most of the inspiring mobs are going to be crowd controllable, I have noticed. So if you want, you have this option, which you didn't have before. So if we consider inspiring as a variation of an affix we have had before, this is an improved one because it does allow you, if you want, to pull the pack away from the inspired mobs without as much trouble as you previously had in BFA. It isn't the best, I don't think, but it's also not the worst. Like, to me, it's a fine affix. Now on to Spiteful and Storming. So I'm just going to give for granted that melee DPS don't like these affixes. Storming is of course pretty annoying for melee DPS, and Spiteful is also annoying for melee DPS because these are all proximity based affixes because they spawn from the mobs, and because ranged are away from the mobs, all these affixes are going to affect melee DPS more. Now, if it is something that didn't do damage but required some coordination like Explosive, a melee DPS doesn't mind to have an explosive orb spawning next to him. If it's something that is about positioning, then I'm sure Sanguine, a melee DPS doesn't mind too much either. They can DPS on the move, it's not that they are massively hindered by Sanguine, it's not too big of a deal. But these two, Storming and Spiteful, can become annoying because the counterplay goes missing. You know, the counterplay for Storming, sure, is to dodge, but sometimes it becomes a little bit too annoying. It becomes a little bit too hectic. Remember, as a melee, you also have the honors to be the one who stuns, to be the one who crowd controls or to who interrupts, way more than a ranged DPS. And now you have to deal with Storming as well. If you compare it to the effort a ranged DPS has to put in to dodge a Volcanic, there is no comparison. It's much simpler. Basically, the only comparison is if Volcanic would be a lava burst, basically exploding into 4 to 5 different smaller circles on the ground in random directions. So ranged DPS also had no idea where they were spawning, where they would position, and it would be as annoying as Storming. But it isn't. It is much easier. And then you have, of course, Spiteful. Similar thing. This time there isn't even a counter play other than don't DPS, forehead. Because if there is a couple of mobs left and they are one next to each other and one is dying, what can you possibly do as a melee DPS? Yeah, you can roll the dice and say, it's totally not going to target me, and just ignore the spawn. And if it doesn't work, and if you're anywhere above like a 12, you get one shot. Or you simply have to just step 5-10 yards away, wait to see the target. If it's not targeting you, go back. If it is, then you have to no DPS for like 10 seconds. So I like the idea of Spiteful. I also like the idea of Storming. I just wish they had a tiny bit more counterplay. I mentioned a possible solution, which isn't about counterplay to be fair, but it can bring more evenness between ranged and melee, which is the fact that Spiteful should spawn randomly. Essentially, when the mob dies, for example, there is essentially a shadow orb popping out of the mob, landing somewhere closer to the players, and then fixating on someone. This would essentially make Spiteful more even, because it can now spawn and pop in the air next to a ranged DPS, for example. And now they would be in the same situation as a melee DPS. That's the only thing that came to mind when it comes to Spiteful. When it comes to Storming, something like a couple of seconds of grace period to allow the melee DPS to move. Maybe something like starting from the melee but then going towards the ranged. Again, trying to seek some sort of parity for melee and ranged with this type of affixes. But in general, I don't think even the more pessimistic and glass half empty type of guy can deny that this first season of Mythic Plus in Shadowlands has been an improvement over BFA. The removed affixes compared to the addition of the new ones, as well as the reworked current affixes that were already there in BFA and even in Legion, I think make Mythic Plus much better than it was before. Let me guys know what you think about this. I will not allow any more melee whining. I have already defended you long enough here. No need to do it in the comments. So we will see what video is going to come out tomorrow. I don't even know myself, so stay tuned. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I would say F for teaming, but literally nobody is missing it.